October 28, 1943. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The United States Navy conducts what they call a routine degaussing experiment on destroyer escort USS Eldridge. It's not routine, it's Project Rainbow, a classified attempt to render warships invisible to enemy radar using experimental electromagnetic field generators. At 0923 hours, the ship vanishes completely. 4 minutes later, it reappears. The crew is screaming. Sailors are found fused to the ship's bulkheads, their bodies merged with steel. Some have aged decades in minutes, others remember timelines that haven't happened yet. The Navy buries everything, destroys the evidence, silences the witnesses, but 3 men leave testimony behind. What they documented should not exist. What's still happening in Nevada facilities proves the experiment never ended. This is the classified truth about the USS Eldridge. The envelope arrived at my desk with no return address, postmarked Philadelphia, dated November 1979. Inside, 17 pages of typewritten testimony on U.S. Naval Hospital stationery, yellowed at the edges, stamped confidential in faded red ink. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. James Rinehart, Lieutenant Commander, Medical Corps, United States Navy. According to Navy records, Rinehart died of myocardial infarction 3 days after the postmark date. According to the document in my hands, he'd been carrying secrets that killed him 36 years too late. I'm a civilian researcher now, but I spent 12 years with naval intelligence before the politics and compartmentalization drove me out. I still have contacts. I still have clearances that technically expired but opened doors anyway. When you've seen how deep the classification rabbit hole goes, you develop instincts about what's real and what's disinformation. The Rinehart Testament felt real in a way that made my hands shake. The document began with a date, October 28, 1943. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Pier 4, USS Eldridge, hull number DE 173, a Cannon-class destroyer escort fresh from the yards. Rinehart had been assigned to observe a degaussing experiment, standard procedure for wartime vessels operating in magnetic minefields. The official story, the one that's been public knowledge since the 1950s, claims nothing unusual happened. The Navy's position has never wavered. The Philadelphia experiment is fiction, a hoax perpetuated by charlatan Carl Allen and sensationalist authors. Rinehart's testimony told a different story. The experiment began at 0917 hours. Rinehart was stationed on the observation deck with 5 other medical personnel, clipboards ready to document any physiological effects on the crew. The Eldridge was surrounded by 4 sieve generators, experimental equipment that had been installed under direct orders from the Office of Naval Intelligence. The technical specifications were beyond Rinehart's expertise, but he noted the equipment bore manufacturer stamps from Westinghouse and General Electric, civilian contractors working under wartime priority codes. When the generators activated, the air pressure changed. Rinehart described it as swimming through invisible molasses, a resistance that made breathing deliberate and difficult. The Eldridge began to glow, a greenish luminescence that seemed to emanate from the hull itself, rather than reflecting external light. Sailors on deck moved in slow motion, their gestures dreamlike and disconnected. Then the fog came. It wasn't weather. Rinehart was explicit about this distinction. The fog materialized around the Eldridge in violation of atmospheric physics, a dense gray-green cloud that boiled up from nowhere and swallowed the ship in under 30 seconds. Through binoculars, Rinehart watched sailors disappear into the fog, their screams audible but distorted, stretched across frequencies that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. The electromagnetic readings spiked so high that 2 monitoring instruments exploded, showering the observation deck with glass and sparks. At 09:23 hours, the Eldridge vanished. Not metaphorically, not hidden by fog. The destroyer escort ceased to exist in Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Radar operators confirmed zero contacts. Visual observers confirmed empty water. 306 feet of warship, weighing 1,400 tons fully loaded, simply wasn't there anymore. The fog remained, swirling in a perfect ship-shaped void, but the Eldridge was gone. Rinehart's account of the next 4 minutes is fragmentary, contaminated by what he later recognized as temporal perception distortion. He remembered shouting. He remembered alarms. He remembered a commander whose name was redacted from the document ordering all generators shut down immediately. But he also remembered watching the entire sequence happen backwards, generators powering down before the order was given, alarms silencing before they began. Time wasn't flowing correctly on the observation deck. At 09:27 hours, the Eldridge reappeared. It came back wrong. Rinehart noticed immediately. The ship's profile was identical, the hull number matched, but something fundamental had changed. The metal looked older, oxidized in patterns that suggested years of weathering compressed into 4 minutes. Barnacles encrusted sections of the hull that had been pristine before the experiment, and the crew was screaming. Medical personnel rushed aboard within minutes. Rinehart was third through the forward hatch. What he found defied everything he'd learned at Johns Hopkins Medical School. 5 sailors were embedded in the bulkheads, their bodies partially merged with the steel infrastructure of the ship. Not crushed, not pressed against, merged. Rinehart documented cellular fusion, organic tissue blended with inorganic metal in configurations that shouldn't exist outside of advanced metallurgical labs. Seaman Michael Kowalski was still alive, his right arm absorbed into a support beam from shoulder to fingertips. He was conscious. He was screaming. Rinehart administered morphine, but the seaman kept talking, babbling about seeing his own funeral, about watching himself age and die, about being in Philadelphia and Norfolk simultaneously. When Rinehart checked his pupils, they were different colors, not heterochromia. The left eye was blue, normal and responsive. The right eye was brown and clouded with cataracts, the eye of a 70-year-old man in a 23-year-old face. The medical examination of the Eldridge crew took 16 hours. Rinehart's team processed 63 survivors, each presenting impossible physiological anomalies. Tissue samples showed cellular structures aged at different rates. One sailor's heart tissue dated to approximately 60 years of chronological age, while his lungs measured 25 years. Another exhibited bone density consistent with advanced osteoporosis in his left femur, while his right femur showed the robust density of athletic youth. Carbon dating would later confirm what Rinehart suspected. Different parts of the same human body had experienced different quantities of elapsed time. 17 crew members were unaccounted for. They hadn't died. They'd vanished. Personal effects remained at their duty stations. Coffee cups still steaming, cigarettes still burning. But the men were gone, and they never came back. Over the following weeks, 3 survivors went insane. 2 committed suicide, and 1 man allegedly achieved spontaneous human combustion while walking through a bar in Philadelphia, witnessed by 14 civilians who were immediately detained and debriefed under national security protocols. The Office of Naval Intelligence arrived on October 29th. They confiscated all medical records, all photographic evidence, all physical samples. Rinehart and his team were separated, reassigned to different duty stations, required to sign non-disclosure agreements backed by threats of court-martial and treason charges. The official incident report concluded that minor equipment malfunction had caused temporary disorientation among crew members, nothing more. The Eldridge was recommissioned and served with distinction for the remainder of the war. But Rinehart kept copies, tissue slides hidden in personal luggage, photographs tucked inside medical textbooks, witness statements memorized and transcribed years later, and he kept asking questions that ended careers. The final section of Rinehart's testimony was dated October 1979, written in a shakier hand than the earlier pages. He described meetings with ONI officials who visited him periodically throughout the decades, always asking the same questions. Who had he told? What evidence remained? Would he stay silent? He described watching colleagues from the Eldridge medical team die in improbable accidents. Car crashes, gas leaks, heart attacks in men with no cardiac history. By 1979, Rinehart was the last surviving witness. The experiment wasn't about degaussing. Rinehart had pieced it together from fragments overheard, documents glimpsed, deathbed confessions from physicists who'd worked on the project. The generators weren't designed to disrupt magnetic fields. They were designed to fold space-time, to render vessels invisible by displacing them through dimensional coordinates human mathematics barely acknowledged. The Navy had succeeded. They'd made a ship vanish and reappear 200 miles away instantaneously. They'd also discovered that human biology wasn't compatible with the process. Rinehart's final paragraph was a warning. The research hadn't stopped. The Philadelphia experiment was proof of concept. Somewhere, in facilities with budgets that didn't appear in congressional records, the work continued, improved, weaponized. He'd heard rumors of temporal displacement research at Montauk, whispers about dimensional doorways at Brookhaven National Laboratory. The Eldridge was just the beginning, and the men fused to those bulkheads were just the acceptable losses in a classified arms race that traded human lives for technological supremacy. I verified what I could. ONI records from 1943 are conveniently incomplete. The Eldridge's service record contains a 4-day gap in October that's explained as clerical error. Rinehart's medical license was mysteriously suspended in 1947, reinstated a year later with no explanation. And 3 days after mailing his testimony, his heart stopped in a restaurant in Bethesda, witnessed by 2 men in dark suits who declined to provide statements to police. The envelope contained one final item I haven't mentioned yet. A tissue slide, labeled in Rinehart's handwriting, Kowalski, Michael J., USN. Right arm tissue, October 28, 1943. I had it analyzed by a lab that doesn't ask questions. The cells showed structural damage consistent with rapid temporal acceleration. The tissue was 23 years old chronologically, and biologically it had aged 147 years. Somewhere in a classified facility, they're still running the experiment, and somewhere sailors are still screaming. The second document arrived 3 weeks after the first. Same anonymous mailing pattern, different postmark. Norfolk, Virginia, dated December 1979. This one was shorter, only 9 pages, but the paper quality was different. Official naval correspondence stock, the kind with embedded security fibers visible under ultraviolet light. The header read, "Eyes only. Majestic clearance required." Below that, a name I recognized, Captain Eugene Hartley, Naval Intelligence Liaison, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, October to November 1943. Hartley had been dead since 1981. Official cause: stroke. But according to the document in my hands, he'd spent 36 years trying to reconcile what he'd witnessed with the laws of physics and failing. His account didn't contradict Rinehart's medical testimony. It provided the operational context, the classified mission parameters that explained why the Navy had deliberately ripped holes in space-time with a crew aboard. The Philadelphia experiment was designated Project Rainbow, a subdivision of a larger research initiative codenamed Project Invisibility. Hartley's security clearance gave him access to the theoretical framework. The generators weren't Navy technology. They'd been designed by a team of civilian physicists working under wartime emergency powers, led by a man whose name was redacted throughout the document but whose theoretical work on unified field theory was unmistakable. The goal wasn't just radar invisibility. It was complete electromagnetic cloaking, rendering vessels undetectable to any known sensing equipment. The math worked on paper. The first small-scale tests with unmanned vessels had succeeded flawlessly. A 40-foot patrol boat had vanished from instruments for 17 seconds, reappeared with no apparent damage. Encouraged by this success, the Office of Naval Intelligence authorized human trials. The Eldridge was selected because it was new, because it was expendable in the broader context of wartime operations, and because its crew could be compartmentalized under national security protocols. Hartley admitted in his document that he'd raised objections. The theoretical models showed disturbing possibilities that the physicists had dismissed as statistical noise. There were equations suggesting that electromagnetic fields of sufficient intensity might interact with biological neural tissue in unpredictable ways. There were calculations indicating potential temporal displacement effects if the field generators achieved certain resonance frequencies. The lead physicist had assured Hartley these were remote theoretical possibilities, acceptable risks in wartime. The physicist had been catastrophically wrong. Hartley's account of October 28th matched Rinehart's timeline, but included operational details that made my blood run cold. The experiment had been scheduled for 0917 hours, but the activation sequence had been programmed to run automatically without human intervention once initiated. This wasn't standard protocol. Someone had insisted on automation, removing the possibility of hesitation or abort commands during the critical field generation phase. Hartley didn't know who'd given that order, but the authorization bore a signature he didn't recognize and a clearance level above his own. When the Eldridge vanished at 0923 hours, simultaneous radar contacts appeared at 3 separate locations. One was in Norfolk, Virginia, precisely where later witness testimony would place the ship during its 4-minute disappearance. Another was in the mid-Atlantic, coordinates matching a position the Eldridge would occupy during convoy operations 3 months in the future. The third contact appeared in Philadelphia Naval Shipyard at the exact location of the Eldridge, but the timestamp on the radar return was corrupted, displaying dates ranging from 1943 to 1983. The ship hadn't just moved through space, it had intersected with multiple points in its own timeline, existing in 3 locations and 4 temporal coordinates simultaneously. When the generators shut down and the Eldridge reappeared in Philadelphia, it brought back contamination from those other time frames. Hartley documented objects found aboard that shouldn't have existed. A maintenance log dated April 1944 detailing repairs not yet performed, a photograph of sailors who wouldn't report for duty until January 1944, a spent shell casing from anti-aircraft guns that hadn't been installed yet. The crew had experienced all of it. Every timeline, every location, every possible version of their service aboard the Eldridge, compressed into 4 minutes of subjective experience. Their neural tissue had recorded memories of events that hadn't happened yet, that might never happen, that existed only in probability space until observation collapsed the waveform. Human consciousness wasn't designed to process nonlinear causality. The screaming Rinehart had documented wasn't pain. It was cognitive disintegration, minds literally tearing themselves apart, trying to reconcile contradictory timelines. Hartley's document included crew interviews conducted in the days following the experiment, before ONI had fully implemented the cover-up. Seaman First Class David Chen reported remembering his own death in 3 different ways: drowning during a torpedo attack in 1944, dying of cancer in a VA hospital in 1967, and ceasing to exist during the Philadelphia experiment itself. When questioned, he could provide specific details for all 3 death scenarios, including conversations he'd had with doctors who wouldn't be born for another 20 years. Petty Officer James Sullivan described serving aboard the Eldridge for 4 years during the 4-minute experiment. He remembered convoy operations, shore leave in North Africa, a promotion to Chief Petty Officer in 1945. He also remembered the ship being decommissioned in 1946, being sold to Greece in 1951, serving in the Hellenic Navy until 1992. These weren't hallucinations. Sullivan could draw accurate deck plans showing modifications not yet made, could name crew members not yet assigned, could describe equipment installations that naval records confirmed would occur exactly as he'd described them. The most disturbing testimony came from gunner's mate Robert Fisher. Fisher claimed he'd experienced the experiment from multiple perspectives simultaneously: his own consciousness aboard the Eldridge, his consciousness observing from the Norfolk location, his consciousness in the future reading classified reports about his own death, and his consciousness in a timeline where the experiment had never occurred and he'd served routine convoy duty throughout the war. When asked which timeline was real, Fisher had laughed until he started crying and couldn't stop. He was committed to a psychiatric facility 3 days later, diagnosed with acute schizophrenia. He died there in 1956, never having recovered coherent speech. Hartley had argued for immediate termination of Project Rainbow. The human cost was unacceptable, the results were uncontrollable, and the theoretical implications were terrifying. If the Eldridge had truly occupied multiple time frames simultaneously, if objects and information could leak between timelines, if causality itself could be disrupted, then continuing the research risked consequences beyond anyone's authority to authorize. His objections were overruled. The project was classified above top secret, compartmentalized beyond even Hartley's substantial clearance level. The decision to continue came from somewhere higher up the chain of command, from offices that didn't officially exist and budgets that appeared nowhere in Navy accounting. The generators were modified. Hartley didn't have access to the technical specifications, but he saw the equipment being altered in the weeks following the initial experiment. The civilian physics team was replaced by military personnel with specialized training he couldn't identify. New contractors arrived with equipment in unmarked crates, working under armed guard, speaking languages Hartley didn't recognize. The Eldridge remained in Philadelphia for 6 weeks, officially undergoing routine maintenance, actually serving as a test platform for refined dimensional displacement technology. There were 3 additional experiments. Hartley wasn't present for any of them, having been reassigned to administrative duties that kept him planetside and isolated. But he heard rumors. A second test with reduced power settings that produced localized time distortions affecting only portions of the ship. Sailors reporting that forward sections of the vessel experienced time at different rates than aft sections, conversations becoming desynchronized, cause and effect relationships breaking down. A third test attempting to create a stable temporal anchor point, resulting in a containment breach that supposedly killed everyone within 50 meters of the primary generator. A fourth test that succeeded in achieving controlled invisibility for 17 minutes, but left the entire crew catatonic, their neural activity reduced to persistent vegetative state. After the fourth test, Project Rainbow was officially terminated. The Eldridge was transferred to active service, its experimental equipment removed and destroyed. Or so the official documentation claimed. Hartley had evidence suggesting otherwise. Transfer orders for the generators to a research facility in Nevada, personnel reassignments to locations that didn't appear on any Navy installation roster, and payments, substantial payments, to families of sailors who'd officially died in training accidents but whose bodies were never released for burial. Hartley's final pages detailed his 3-decade investigation into what had happened to the research. He'd tracked equipment serial numbers through procurement records. He'd followed personnel transfers through back channels and unofficial networks. He'd collected testimony from witnesses who'd seen things they couldn't explain at Navy facilities across the continental United States. The Philadelphia experiment hadn't ended. It had metastasized. Reports from Montauk Air Force Station described temporal anomalies affecting radar equipment in the 1950s and 1960s. Witnesses at Camp Hero spoke of seeing people who shouldn't exist, ghosts of possible futures walking through solid walls, time itself becoming unstable in underground facilities where the Navy had installed equipment matching the Philadelphia generator's technical specifications. Hartley had a source inside the Defense Intelligence Agency who confirmed that temporal displacement research was ongoing, funded through black budget appropriations that congressional oversight never touched. The technology had improved. Instead of catastrophic uncontrolled effects, they'd achieved refined manipulation of space-time on limited scales. Hartley's source described chairs that could age objects decades in minutes, rooms where time flowed backwards, containment vessels that existed outside normal causality. And they were still using human subjects, volunteers who didn't fully understand what they were volunteering for, soldiers who disappeared from official rosters and reappeared years later with no memory of the interval, mental patients whose consent was legally questionable and whose testimony was preemptively discredited. Hartley had tried to go public in 1952. He'd been visited by men in civilian clothes carrying credentials from agencies he'd never heard of. They'd been polite, professional, and absolutely clear about the consequences of disclosure. His family was mentioned. His pension was mentioned. The ease with which accidental deaths could be arranged was mentioned. Hartley had backed down, signed the additional non-disclosure agreements, and spent the next 27 years watching the research continue while he documented everything he could find. His final paragraph was addressed to whoever received his testimony. The Philadelphia experiment proved that human consciousness was fundamentally incompatible with nonlinear time. Every attempt to weaponize temporal displacement had resulted in madness, death, or worse. The men fused to the Eldridge bulkheads were mercy cases compared to what came later. Somewhere in Nevada, in facilities buried under desert sand and mountains of classification, they were still running experiments, still breaking minds, still treating causality as a weapon and human beings as acceptable collateral damage in a war against physics itself. I spent 2 months verifying Hartley's claims. Camp Hero's history contains gaps that official explanations don't adequately cover. Defense appropriations from 1950 to 1980 include line items for projects that don't exist in any declassified records. And 3 physicists who worked on electromagnetic field research during World War II all died within 6 months of each other in 1981, causes ranging from suicide to mysterious laboratory accidents. The tissue sample from Rinehart's envelope was still in my possession. I had it tested by a different lab, one with equipment sophisticated enough to analyze cellular structure at the molecular level. The results came back with a note from the lab director asking where I'd obtained biological samples from someone who'd been dead for over a century while simultaneously showing signs of recent metabolic activity. I didn't answer. I destroyed the sample, burned the lab report, and started looking into one-way flights to countries without extradition treaties. Because 3 days after I received Hartley's document, I started experiencing memories that weren't mine, conversations I'd never had, places I'd never been. And every night when I closed my eyes, I saw the Eldridge, glowing green in Philadelphia fog, existing in too many places at once while sailors screamed in timelines that would never stop happening. The third envelope didn't arrive by mail. I found it in my apartment, placed on my desk between the keyboard and coffee mug I'd been using that morning. No forced entry, no security system alerts, just an envelope that hadn't existed at 0800 hours, and definitely existed at 1347 hours when I returned from a deliberately random route through the city, checking for surveillance at every corner. The postmark was impossible. Philadelphia, October 28, 1943. Not a reproduction, not a forgery. The postal cancellation mark used ink formulations that hadn't been manufactured since 1947, verified by a collector I knew who specialized in World War II memorabilia. The paper had aged 79 years naturally, showed oxidation patterns consistent with long-term storage, and somehow contained a document written on a typewriter that wouldn't be manufactured until 1968. The signature at the bottom was Michael J. Kowalski, Seaman Second Class, United States Navy. According to official records, Kowalski died during the Philadelphia experiment, his body too extensively damaged by the temporal displacement to survive. According to Rinehart's testimony, Kowalski had been alive when medical personnel arrived, fused to a bulkhead, babbling about simultaneous time frames. According to the document now in my hands, Kowalski had never stopped existing, caught in a recursive causality loop that kept him alive and dying across 8 decades. The testimony was fragmentary, written in multiple handwriting styles that shifted mid-sentence. Some sections were typed, others were handwritten in shaking script. A few paragraphs appeared to be printed from computer systems that shouldn't have existed when the paper was manufactured. The content was worse than the format. Kowalski was trying to explain what happened to human consciousness when it experienced non-linear time, and the explanation was breaking reality around itself. Kowalski described the moment of fusion. The generators had reached resonance frequency at 0923 hours and 17 seconds. The electromagnetic field had intensified beyond the theoretical safety threshold, and Kowalski had been standing 3 meters from the starboard generator when space-time folded. He didn't feel pain initially. He felt expansion, his consciousness stretching across probability space like rubber pulled too thin. Every possible version of himself became simultaneously real. The version that died in the experiment, the version that survived to old age, the version that never enlisted, the version that existed in timelines where the Eldridge never sailed. The bulkhead had been in the same position across multiple time frames. When reality snapped back, Kowalski's arm occupied the same spatial coordinates as the steel support beam, but at different temporal coordinates. His flesh from 1943 merged with metal from 1944, molecular bonds forming connections that physics couldn't support but couldn't undo. He was 23 years old and 70 years old and unborn all at once. The pain came then, not from the fusion, but from consciousness trying to process causality moving in every direction simultaneously. Rinehart had given him morphine. Kowalski remembered that across 17 different time frames. In some versions, the morphine worked. In others, it accelerated the temporal decay, his cells aging centuries and seconds while Rinehart watched helplessly. In the timeline he was currently inhabiting, though currently had lost all meaning, the morphine had been contaminated with something else, something that interacted catastrophically with the temporal displacement field still resonating in his tissue. Oni had tried to extract him from the bulkhead. Kowalski provided technical details of the extraction attempt, equipment specifications from tools that wouldn't be invented for another 30 years. They'd used plasma cutters to separate his arm from the steel, but the fusion existed across temporal boundaries. Cutting through the physical connection didn't sever the chronological entanglement. His arm remained fused to the bulkhead in 1943, while the rest of him existed in 1944, 1967, 1983, and timelines that hadn't occurred yet, but were already collapsing into his consciousness. The extraction had killed him in most time frames: heart failure, shock, catastrophic cellular breakdown. But in at least one timeline, the one he was writing from, he'd survived. Barely. ONI had moved him to a classified medical facility, location redacted throughout the document, but details suggesting somewhere in the Nevada desert. They'd kept him alive using techniques that shouldn't exist, technology reverse-engineered from the very temporal displacement that had destroyed him. Kowalski's testimony became increasingly difficult to parse after the first 4 pages. The chronology collapsed. He'd written about events from 1943 and 1979 in the same paragraph, unable to maintain linear narrative structure because his consciousness no longer experienced linear time. He described conversations with researchers in the 1950s who asked him questions about experiments that wouldn't occur until the 1970s. He remembered future versions of himself visiting him in the past, trying to warn him not to volunteer for the Eldridge, creating paradoxes that spawned new timeline branches that all became equally real. The facility where they kept him was dedicated to temporal research. Kowalski provided fragmentary details: underground installation, 12 levels deep, shielded against electromagnetic detection and chronological observation. He wasn't the only subject. There were others, sailors from the Eldridge who'd survived the initial experiment but couldn't exist in normal space-time. Some had been reduced to quantum states, existing as probability clouds that occasionally collapsed into physical form. Others had become temporally locked, aging backwards or experiencing time at accelerated rates, decades passing in hours while they screamed in isolation chambers. The researchers weren't trying to cure them. They were studying the effects, documenting the ways human biology adapted to temporal displacement. Kowalski had become a living laboratory, his cells analyzed thousands of times across multiple time frames. They'd discovered that his DNA had been altered by the displacement field, mutations that affected how his molecular structure interacted with causality. Some of his cells existed in quantum superposition, simultaneously in multiple states until observed. Others had developed temporal resistance, aging slower than normal tissue, creating internal chronological inconsistencies that should have killed him, but instead produced biological impossibilities. He'd tried to kill himself 17 times across various time frames, hanging, poison, deliberate cellular decay, triggered by focusing his consciousness on specific tissue regions. None of the attempts had succeeded permanently. Death itself had become a probability state he could access, but not remain in. He'd experienced his own autopsy 3 times, watching from outside his body while pathologists dissected tissue that was simultaneously alive and dead, existing in quantum states that confused the observers until they abandoned attempts at categorization. The worst part, Kowalski wrote, wasn't the pain or the endless recursion of consciousness across time frames. It was knowledge. Being unstuck in time meant experiencing the future, seeing where the research led, understanding what the Philadelphia experiment had actually been intended to accomplish. Project Rainbow wasn't about radar invisibility. It was proof of concept for temporal warfare, weaponizing causality itself to attack enemies before they existed or after they'd been defeated, or in probability, spaces where they'd never been born. He'd seen the timeline where they succeeded, where temporal displacement technology became operational by 1955, where American forces could strike Soviet targets retroactively, where the Cold War was fought across decades simultaneously, with soldiers experiencing battles in nonlinear sequences. He had also seen the timeline where the technology destroyed causality itself, where too many temporal interventions created paradox cascades that unraveled reality from multiple direction points. That timeline ended in 1967, when the universe simply stopped processing cause and effect, and everything froze in quantum superposition forever. Most timelines fell somewhere between those extremes. Continued research, incremental improvements, occasional catastrophic failures that killed researchers and destroyed facilities, but never quite convinced the military to abandon the work. Kowalski had watched decades of experiments from his containment cell, existed in multiple facility locations simultaneously as the research program moved and evolved. He'd met himself at different ages, creating recursive loops where information flowed backwards through his own timeline, contaminating earlier versions with knowledge from futures that might not occur. The document included a schematic, crude hand-drawn diagram showing connections between facilities across the United States. Philadelphia linked to Nevada, linked to Montauk, linked to locations I didn't recognize. Lines between them labeled with project names, some I'd heard of, most I hadn't. Rainbow connected to Pegasus, connected to Phoenix, connected to designations that were just alphanumeric codes. The dates ranged from 1943 to 2003, suggesting operational continuity across 6 decades. Kowalski claimed the research never stopped because it couldn't stop. The initial Philadelphia experiment had created a temporal anchor point, a fixed causality coordinate that every subsequent experiment referenced whether intentionally or not. The Eldridge at 0923 hours on October 28, 1943, had become a chronological singularity, a moment that existed in too many timeframes simultaneously. Every time researchers activated temporal displacement equipment anywhere in the world, They created resonance with that original event. The Eldridge was still there, still vanishing and reappearing, still fusing sailors to bulkheads, happening continuously across an expanding web of probability space. The final pages were barely coherent. Kowalski's handwriting degraded to frantic scrawling, words overlapping across temporal layers, sentences that started in one time frame and finished in another. He was trying to warn me about something specific, but the message kept collapsing into paradox. He'd seen me reading his testimony in multiple futures. In some, I destroyed the documents and lived out a normal life. In others, I continued investigating and died in accidents that were statistically improbable, but chronologically inevitable. In one particularly detailed timeline, I joined the research program, became one of them, spent decades studying temporal displacement while knowing it would eventually destroy everything. He included coordinates, Nevada test site, Area 51 adjacent territory, underground facility accessible through maintenance tunnels that officially didn't exist. He claimed the Eldridge generators were still there, still operational, still being used for experiments that grew more ambitious and more reckless with each iteration. He'd seen the endgame timeline where they succeeded in creating stable temporal displacement for military operations. It lasted 14 months before causality unraveled completely and reality experienced total chronological collapse. The document ended mid-sentence. I'm writing this in 1943 and 1979 and 2003. And you are reading it in all of those years simultaneously because the experiment never ended. It just keeps expanding across time. And eventually it reaches you and you become part of the recursion. And I can see you in the facility now, even though you haven't arrived yet and you're... The rest of the page was blank, not torn off, not redacted, just absent, as if the words existed in a timeline that hadn't solidified yet. I verified what I could, knowing verification was meaningless when dealing with nonlinear causality. The coordinates Kowalski provided matched classified facility locations, identified in declassified documents from the 1990s. The project names appeared in FOIA requests that had been denied on national security grounds, and the handwriting analysis showed something impossible. Sections of the document had been written by the same person at different ages, 20-year-old Kowalski and 70-year-old Kowalski contributing to the same testimony across the same pages. 3 days after finding the third envelope, I started losing time. Hours disappeared with no memory of what I'd done. I'd be reading at my desk and suddenly it would be 6 hours later with no transition. Security camera footage from my building showed me leaving and returning multiple times during periods I remembered as continuous presence. My coffee went cold and hot again without me touching it. Objects moved when I wasn't looking, and twice I found notes in my own handwriting containing information I didn't remember learning. The temporal contamination was spreading. Kowalski had warned me, embedded in those fragmentary final paragraphs. Reading the testimony created quantum entanglement with the original event. My consciousness was being pulled toward the Philadelphia experiment anchor point, existing in multiple time frames simultaneously, becoming another recursive element in the causality loop. I burned all 3 documents, destroyed the tissue samples, erased digital files. It didn't matter. The information existed in my memory, and memory wasn't bound by linear time once you'd been exposed to temporal displacement fields. I could remember the future now, fragments of timelines that hadn't occurred yet. I remembered writing this report, and I remembered it being classified after my death, and I remembered reading it myself in 2043 as an old man who'd spent 6 decades trying to forget. The Eldridge is still out there, still happening, still ripping holes in causality with every iteration of the experiment. Somewhere in Nevada, they're still running the generators. And somewhere across an infinite recursion of probability space, Michael Kowalski is still fused to that bulkhead, experiencing every moment of his existence simultaneously, unable to die because death is just another timeline, and he exists in all of them. I don't know when I wrote this. I don't know when you're reading it. The timestamps on the file keep changing. All I know is that the Philadelphia experiment never ended, and now, neither will we. The timeline collapses here. I can see myself at the Nevada facility. I haven't gone yet, but I remember arriving. The generators are still running. They've always been running. And the Eldridge keeps vanishing, keeps returning, keeps spreading temporal contamination across decades that exists simultaneously in a recursion that won't stop until causality itself forgets how to function. God help us all. We created a weapon that kills chronologically, and we can't shut it down because it's already killed us in every timeline where we tried.